I often welcome visitors to this Museum of the Macabre, and that welcome includes a few words of caution. One should always be mindful of the horrors that lurk in the far-flung regions of the earth. And therefore I offer you Exhibit A tale called The Ice Demon, because there is a frozen wasteland, even here on the Nightfall radio show. Mark Fitzgerald was the captain of a small icebreaker ship in the Canadian Arctic Ocean. He and 6 others of his members on the 65-footer were headed back to Hudson Bay via the Hudson Strait. This trip in particular was shorter and was expected to be a fairly easy one, but Fitzgerald underestimated the thickness of the sea ice during this trip. Fitzgerald was not the type of man who worried easily. He'd sailed over 100 times throughout the Arctic Ocean in his life, through the empty, desolate, cold no-man's land. He had no friends and hardly any family to remember. His life was primarily his job, which to a lot of people would be a place of grief, but to him, it was hardly brain surgery. He navigated most of his life with that type of attitude. Nothing could ever be too tough for the old Fitzgerald that all his comrades knew. However, his cockiness didn't prepare him for what was next for him to endure. To Fitzgerald's surprise and to the dismay of the crew, there was a leak in the boat. So much time had passed since it had been noticed that the ship had a significant amount of water filling the lower vessel of the ship. The amount of water entering the ship was becoming increasingly dangerous. Icebreaker sinking was a very rare issue, and a situation Fitzgerald never truly thought he would have to address. Of course, he and his crew, with their long-time experience, had had plenty of drills on situations such as these. However, no number of drills in preparation could make the weight of the stress and bewilderment any less overwhelming. A lot of men such as Fitzgerald himself lived their lives never picturing such things happening to them, but only to other people. Fitzgerald and his crew's dread sunk even deeper when they realized they'd have to evacuate the ship. Stranded in such a harsh, desolate, and hopeless place, Fitzgerald and his crew boarded small lifeboats from the ship, desperate to find the closest ice raft big enough to fit all 7 souls. When they did, it was almost a relief. All 7 men exited the small boat and onto the ice raft, where they were able to pull their small boat onto the raft with them. Fitzgerald made sure to bring some necessities from the shipwreck: a small tent, fire starter, portable stove, flares, packaged food and water, some extra clothes, and the first aid kit. It was midday and all 7 men sat on their raft floating in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, taking in the view of their abandoned sinking ship about a mile away. Their grief gave way to acceptance of their possible deaths and the fact that they were stranded in such a place no human was meant to be. As he sat taking in the infinite expanse of ice and water, Fitzgerald grew tired of sitting and decided to walk around their small icy island, exploring the only thing separating them from the -2 degrees Celsius water. At the other end of the raft, Fitzgerald discovered the remains of a huge skeleton. The only thing that came to his mind was some type of pinniped. The rest of the crew had warmed up some of their food on their portable stove. Fitzgerald made his way to join his men, not mentioning his discovery in fear of worrying the crew. They ate, talked, joked, and laughed, despite their impending doom of being condemned to the icy hell around them. The winds picked up and sent unforgiving cold right through them, cold that penetrated their bones. Fitzgerald began to worry as he felt a tingling numbness in his toes. If only he and his comrades had appropriate kindling for a fire. He contemplated lighting the extra clothes he brought the crew and himself on fire to help avoid frostbite. However, these concerns soon grew minuscule. The men noticed some distance away a white figure bobbing in the water. Fitzgerald got up and walked to the edge of their raft to try to get a better look, but the object disappeared before his eyes. He walked back to sit with his crew, who asked him what the mysterious figure was, but he had no comfortable answer. The figure appeared once again out of the water and onto the ice raft 100 feet away. And now the men could clearly see a gigantic polar bear. The men were terrified, stranded in a place they weren't supposed to be, up against a beast they were never meant to win against. The ice bear, the ancient beast whose purpose was to kill, and he was flawless at it, and it stared intently at the 7 vulnerable men. The beast jumped off its ice raft and plunged back in the water, resurfacing on another neighboring ice raft. Now, 60 feet away, the bear stared at its weak and vulnerable prey. All the men could do was stare back in horror. The bear plunged back into the ocean and resurfaced on another neighboring ice raft, much closer this time. And now the killing machine was only 20 feet from the men. Standing tall on its front paws, the bear sniffed the air and again stared coldly at the 7 men. The men stared back at the beast's emotionless, small black eyes. They gathered closer together, forming a sort of huddle, as if that would do them any good. It felt like an eternity as the 7 men stared back at the bear's fixed gaze on them. It was as if they were looking at death itself right in the eyes. Never in their lives had any of those men ever felt so weak, so fragile and helpless. There, not too far away, with only a small amount of water separating it from the men, stood a beast that could do anything it possibly pleased to its 7 little victims. The eternal stillness finally was broken as the bear plunged back into the water. Fitzgerald and his men jumped. They all huddled together in the middle of the raft, not knowing when and where the creature of death could possibly reappear next. Hearts pounded and trembled. It felt like an eternity as Fitzgerald and his comrades constantly looked in every direction, continuing to see nothing but moving water and ice all around them, with no predator in sight. For a second, a glimmer of hope arose in Fitzgerald's mind. Maybe, just maybe, the beast lost interest. This was, of course, deception, an evolutionary flaw in the human mind to deny the inevitable reality. As soon as any of the men finished their last breath, the man-eater returned. Climbing onto their ice raft, running faster than any man could react, the beast grabbed Fitzgerald by the top of his cranium and ran with Fitzgerald in his mouth, plunging back into the ocean. The beast climbed onto a neighboring ice raft some 10 feet away with Fitzgerald and began to eat him alive. The now 6 men could only watch as the bear chomped away on their friend, pulling his intestines and other organs out of his body with ease. The beast was totally content while his meal kicked and screamed in pain at the top of its lungs, contrary to the 6 men. They were deeply troubled, and indeed horrified by the screams, squelching, the crunching of bone, and wiggling bloody mass of torn-up flesh that used to be their captain. However, the men could also not look away. It was as if the beast itself forced them into a trance, only to torment them and break their souls. The screaming eventually stopped, and the bear finished chewing on its last piece of meat. All that remained on the island next to them was blood-stained ice and bits and pieces of scattered flesh and bone. The beast lay content in the middle of the mess it made, its white fur now also stained a nice crimson color. Some chunks of matter hung and fell from the animal's face. It was a messy eater. The beast just stared at the 6 men who sat helplessly on the ice raft beside him. It stared intently at its now defeated-looking prey. Each of the 6 men knew that their death was inevitable, and all they were empowered to do was return the gaze.